Vijay, thanks for joining today to have a discussion about you, your history, and some of the great work that you've done. To begin with, can you tell us where you're originally from?
Firstly, great to be with you, Ken. As some of you know in the audience, I'm originally from Mumbai, India. I left India, well, now I'm trying to date myself, in 1982 and came to the US to do my master's. And then ever since I've been here for the last now 35, 37 years.
Great. You talked about coming to do your master's. Can you share with us your education history?
Sure. I went to school, high school in Mumbai, at Bombay International School. It was a great school. I yet have great friends from there. Went to Bombay University, did my undergraduate there, and then came here to Massachusetts at Amherst and did my master's, my MBA in finance at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and then I moved to Washington, D.C.
Excellent. So I guess the next step there is, you begin your career. Tell us a little bit about your professional history.
Yeah, it's been a long journey, I should say. After 84, I joined the World Bank, the IFC actually, a part of the World Bank group in Washington, D.C. I was very much involved there with emerging markets. I worked on a variety of countries from Africa to South Asia, Middle East. And towards the end, it was in the Central Asian republics as the former Soviet Union. The USSR had just broken off, spent a lot of time on privatization and the voucher system out there. And then moved to Franklin Templeton, which is an asset management firm, joined them here in the US, and then relocated to India actually to start the business there in 1985. Took my family, my kids, my wife, lived in a hotel for 6 months, and that was my home and my office actually. It was the go-go days of India's liberalization, and so everybody was trying to get a piece of the action. So I moved there for 4 years. Then we relocated to Singapore for 3 years. I was running Asia Pacific, and then finally came back to California, where Franklin was headquartered. And then 4 years ago, joined Naveen as the CEO. And today I'm the executive chairman of Naveen, which is a competitor of Franklin. It's a global asset management firm.
Interesting. As the executive chairman of Nuveen, would love to hear a little bit about that company.
Yeah, so we are asset managers. We are a subsidiary of TIAA, which has a 100-year rich history of started by Andrew Carnegie, for retirement for educators. Naveen is an asset management firm. We manage roughly about $1.2 trillion in assets. And Naveen really has three pillars. The first is anything we do in the asset management world, we look to generate income. We've generated income for over 100 years. So whether it's in equities or bonds, we look at income as the first criteria for our brand association. The second is alternatives. From the 1.2 trillion, roughly about 30% is in alternatives. And what that really means is hard assets, whether it's real estate, timber, agriculture, private equity. The balance 70% is in stocks and bonds. And then the third pillar of our brand association is ESG, or responsible investing, I should say. And then we can talk a little bit more about that. But basically, anything that we do, all our investments, whether it's stocks, bonds, or alternatives, we look at it through a lens of responsible investing. So those are the three pillars for Naveen. We are headquartered here in the US, but progressively we are expanding overseas. We have offices in Europe, Asia, and Latin America.
Vijay, you talked about ESG, and you certainly have an impressive history of impact investing and working in that space. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you see responsible investing, where we got started with that and where we are now.
Absolutely. So, as I mentioned, one of our pillars for Naveen is responsible investing. And frankly, today everybody's talking about it. But let's go back 50 years. We first did our first investment in South Africa 50 years ago during the apartheid movement. And responsible investing is really all about doing well while doing good. And it really is a journey, not a destination. We've come a long ways over the last 50 years. If you go back to 1970, the famous economist Milton Friedman, who was a Nobel Prize laureate, he talked about companies have only one responsibility, that is to generate a return for their shareholders. We've come a long way since with climate change, with wildfires, hurricanes, and more recently the COVID. Investors are looking to see what management and boards are doing, how they're doing well while doing good. So for example, responsible investing approach has surged nearly 18 times since 1995 to an estimated $12 trillion today. Now it represents $1 in $4 that is invested. That's a 38% increase just over the last 2 years. So what it really means is that the UN, the United Nations, basically set up these SDGs, which are Sustainable Development Goals. There's 17 SDGs. And that's on healthcare, education, women in development, climate change, all the factors that impact the environment and society as a whole. So at Naveen, what we've done is we've looked at that lens while making investments in iron and steel or autos. We look at it with that lens. The next phase from responsible investing is ESG, which is environment, sustainability, and governance. And that is another factor that we see all companies through that lens. We have roughly about $50 billion in ESG products. And then finally is impact investing, which is mostly private equity, where you make an investment, whether it's in financial inclusion, healthcare, where you're trying to make an impact while providing a financial return to your shareholders. So that's really the evolution from responsible investing to ESG to impact. And we've been fortunate that journey we've had over the last 50 years.
That's amazing. And following up on that, you mentioned that the responsibility to the shareholders is to increase the share price. Is that to imply that the type of responsible investing, ESG investing, is providing less of a return to investors?
Absolutely not. In fact, there's enough empirical evidence today to demonstrate that you can do well by doing good. And what is that? It started off by risk mitigation. So unless you look at the environment, you look at sustainability and governance as risk factors. So if you're in a shoe manufacturing company, you have to have a lens to decide what you're doing with labor. And are you paying a fair wage? Is there child labor in the factory? What are you doing with the labor class in that shoe factory? You also have to look at governance to make sure that you have proper governance of disclosure and accounting standards. And finally, on the environmental side, all the dyes that are used or the plastics used in shoes, how is that getting impacted in the environment? And your stock price, frankly, will in fact be assessed by analysts only correctly if you are looking at all these three factors.
As the industry becomes increasingly mainstream, ESG and RI gets more mainstreamed and sophisticated, do we need to have more clarity to define the different categories that exist?
Yes, I think like anything else, the kind of the horse is bolted from the barn. Everybody's talking about ESG and sustainability. The next phase really is on measurement. So I like to go back, in the 1930s, when we had the Great Depression. All companies basically disclosed their financials based on how they felt it was fit, whether you were in Australia, Japan, Europe, or the United States. And it was only after the accounting board came together and you have gap accounting, where an analyst can analyze a car manufacturer in Europe, in the United States, and in Asia across with similar standards of accounting disclosure. Today, with ESG and impact, what we are seeing is there's a lot of greenwashing. So the next phase is going to be how do you disclose impact? How do you disclose your ESG factors in a sustainable manner across various jurisdictions? We're spending a lot of time. Naveen itself, we've set up a Naveen lab that is doing analytics in measuring impact. I myself am on the board of the GIN, which is a platform across globally. And we are looking at IRIS Plus as a measurement tool so that investors, whether you're a retail investor or an institutional investor, you can basically measure impact when management discloses what they're doing. So we are working with stock exchanges, we're working with various NGOs on measurement. I think the next several years, the next phase will be on impact measurement.
So with ESG, we've got all this interest coming along, and where would you say that's coming from? Is it investors, shareholders, is it employees, clients, policymakers? How do all these people factor into that?
Actually, it's all of the above. So let's start with the millennials. The millennials, especially in the United States, are expected to inherit an estimated $30 trillion in the coming decades. Now, the millennials, they are all looking to see how they can create an impact to society while doing well. So 52% in the United States, 52% of high net worth investors say that they would put all their investments in responsible investing. Compare that to 92% of millennial high net worth investors. So as baby boomers pass on their wealth to millennials, millennials are asking for this. Today at Naveen, over 52% of our RFPs, that is request for a proposal for institutional mandates, 52% are asked about our ESG and our responsible investing capabilities. So whether it is advisors, brokers, whether it is consultants, whether it's family offices, whether it's institutional investors or future generational investors, retail investors, they're all asking for this. And so firms, asset managers across the globe today are all looking at their investments with an ESG responsible investing lens. And it took off actually in Europe and Australia first. The US is a fast follower, and I'm sure you're going to see the same in Asia.
All those investors, I'm curious, what are the challenges that ESG RI investors face?
I think it's the taxonomy, it's the definitions. As I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of what I call greenwashing. We don't really know, people talk about it, but I think disclosure and measurement of disclosure is going to be key. It's a little bit like my weight, and New Year is coming up, and as you make your commitments for weight loss, unless you disclose and measure it, you're not going to get there. And so we at Naveen are asking our portfolio companies that if you claim you're doing a certain thing on impact or responsible investing or ESG, you need to disclose it and you need to measure it. And actually, we are working with some of the stock exchanges saying if firms want to get listed on the stock exchange, they're not asking you to do a certain thing, but if you claim you're doing it, you need to disclose it and you need to measure it. So I think that's the next phase of responsible investing in ESG.
What are the biggest opportunities in that space, ESG and RI and impact investing? How does Nuveen, find the opportunities in that space? What do they see as the best opportunities?
I think clearly on the four main areas, whether it's financial inclusion for the masses, whether it's healthcare, or whether it is on climate change and hunger, Nuveen is the largest asset manager in agriculture, for example. So we're spending a lot of time with the farmers where we've invested to making sure that there is responsible use of chemicals, water conservation, because the world population is going to increase from roughly about 7 trillion that it is today to about 10 trillion. And you can't really keep expanding farmland. So it's how do you use farmland and how do you conserve water? We are one of the largest investors in Napa. We own close to 10% of the grapes that are grown in Napa here in California. So we spend a lot of time with the farmers on how to conserve water, how to make sure that we keep the soil rich, because you're seeing a lot of climate change here in California, a lot of wildfires. So we're working on a lot of that. And I think it's the same with listed companies, on diversity and inclusion, for example. We are very much engaged with boards where we make investments to make sure that there is a diverse board with women, with whether it's gender diversity, ethnic diversity, race diversity, because we truly believe it's not diversity for the sake of diversity, but diverse boards, diverse management, actually you have better discussions and you can have better outcomes with a diverse group of people. So we're spending a fair amount of that. And one last point, I must say that I'm pleased to say that the journey my colleagues and I started a few years ago, by the end of December 2020, 100% of our assets, that's the entire 1.2 trillion, our analysts will look at every investment with a responsible investment eye. Doesn't mean we cannot invest in certain, say steel or oil and gas, but we will be engaged with these companies, how to move them towards a more sustainable decision making.
That's impressive. And do you find that in Nuveen itself, there's buy-in across the company for that type of thinking?
Absolutely. I think if you look at Nuveen's management itself, we have a diverse management group. We have a very diverse board. And every hire that we make, we look at it through a diversity lens. And on the responsible investing side, it was a journey, not a destination, to try and get our portfolio managers up to speed on this. It was a long education process, but I'm proud to say today that when they make an investment, one of the criteria they look at is responsible investing. Obviously, they look at returns, cash flow, book to price values, all the standard financial ratios, but they definitely look at the responsible investing angle as well before making an investment.
Are you able to give us some hard statistics of what Nuveen has done in this space?
Absolutely. I think through our investments, both in the private in the private world as well as in the public, stocks and bonds, let me share with you a few things that we've done. For example, we have over 2 million units of affordable housing that we built through our real estate business. Our real estate business has committed that they will meet or surpass the Paris Agreement as far as CO2 emissions are concerned. Not many people know that 15% of CO2 emissions in the world comes from cement and real estate. So that's a big commitment. Another statistic is 2.3 million farmers and fishers trained in creating production sustainability. So we worked very closely with our farmland teams. We have had 74,000 megawatts of renewable energy capability installed as we make investments through our private equity group. Um, we have conserved over 1.1 million acres of land which is an area larger than the country of Sweden. And lastly, 42.6 million people have benefited from clean water and wastewater projects that we've invested in. So these are just some of the examples that we've kind of worked towards over the years as we've made investments globally.
That's great. Vijay, you've shared with us a lot of great information in the ESG, responsible investing, and impact space, about what Naveen is doing, about yourself and your impressive history. Are there any closing thoughts you would want to share with us?
Yeah, I think, I always say that we have to leave the world in a slightly better place than when we came into this world. And I think responsible investing is precisely that. As a society, it's no longer the responsibility of the government to set policies. It's both the private sector and the public sector. And so companies, investors, shareholders, and government policy all coming together, making sure that firms look at responsible investing while making investments, financial investments for the long term. I think the COVID in 2020 has further magnified the need, considering we were seeing such devastation across the globe, whether it's on the healthcare side, whether it is between the haves and the have-nots, that companies today are being analyzed, and what are they really doing for their employees, for their workers, for their factory workers, the blue-collar workers. And I think that is something that I'm personally very passionate about, but I think also investors in general are looking towards as we've made investments globally.
Well, that's fantastic. Thanks once again for joining us today, Vijay.
Thank you, and nice to be here.